As the Third Reich crumbled, the world's eyes fixed on the men who started it all. But in the shadows were their wives, living in stolen mansions, raising toasts while Europe burned. When the empire collapsed, there was no escape left. Their husbands were gone, dead or in chains, and their own fate closed in fast. What followed were arrests and brutal reckonings. These were the last harrowing hours of the women behind the Reich. Inside the bunker with Hitler's wife and Magda Goebbels. By the last months of World War II, Hitler wasn't sitting in a big office giving orders like before. He was trapped under Berlin, hiding in a damp bunker about 28 feet below the city. It wasn't a palace. It wasn't even comfortable. It was just a set of concrete rooms meant to survive bombs.
A replica of where the Nazi regime came to an end. Hitler's bunker faded from history and was later destroyed.
The top part was called the Vorbunker, built in the 1930s. Beneath it was the Führer bunker, finished in 1944, connected by a stairwell and sealed by heavy steel doors. The ceilings were nearly 10 feet thick with reinforced concrete, and in some places, the walls stacked up to about 13 feet. There was even a narrow emergency exit that led into the garden above. But deep down, everyone knew it wasn't really an escape. It was just a trap door to the outside world that none of them would ever truly use. Hitler's own rooms were in the lower section. Early in 1945, his staff tried to make it feel less like a cave by bringing down rugs, couches, and paintings from the chancellery. But no amount of decoration could hide the fact that it was still just cold gray concrete. Pumps had to run all the time to keep groundwater out. A diesel generator cut in and out, rattling the walls. Phones and teleprinters worked one day and went silent the next. The air was always stale, the light weak, the hallways filled with cigarette smoke. Nobody fooled themselves. The war was almost over, and for the people in that bunker, it wasn't going to end well. By mid-January of 1945, Hitler had moved in full-time. Soviet artillery was hitting closer every day. From inside the bunker, he tried to run what was left of his crumbling empire. His quarters were tiny, just a bedroom connected to a study and a map room. A portrait of Frederick the Great hung above his desk, and he often just stared at it quietly. His secretary, Traudl Junge, sat right outside, typing his words. Guards and orderlies shuffled past constantly in the narrow halls. The fans and pumps hummed day and night. Whispers carried everywhere. People barely slept. Everyone was tense. Then came one of the strangest nights in history. Just past midnight on April 29, a group of people squeezed into the bunker's conference room for a wedding. Hitler finally married Eva Braun, the woman who had stayed at his side for years, but out of the spotlight. There was no church, no flowers, no music. Josef Goebbels and Martin Bormann acted as witnesses. The registrar, Walter Wagner, wasn't even important. He was just a city clerk and Volkssturm fighter dragged in from the ruins of Berlin.
It turns into the biggest gridlock in the history of gridlocks.
The entire ceremony took a few minutes. Rings, signatures, done. That was it. But the wedding was just the prelude. Only hours later, around 4 in the morning, Hitler dictated his last political testament and his personal will to Traudl Junge. These weren't drunken rants. They were clear documents, still sitting in the U.S. National Archives today. In them, he swore never to surrender, declared he would rather die than be captured, and demanded that his body and Eva's be burned so the enemy could not use them. He named Admiral Karl Dönitz as his successor. He cut off Hermann Göring and Heinrich Himmler for trying to act on their own. He even left his art collection to a museum he dreamed of building in Linz. Goebbels, Bormann, and others signed their names at the bottom. That same day, something happened that showed how far he had slipped. He no longer trusted the poison capsules in the bunker. So to prove they worked, he ordered one tested on his German Shepherd. Blondie. The cyanide killed the dog instantly. People in the bunker were shattered. For Hitler, it was confirmation. He would never leave the bunker alive. On April 30th, in the afternoon, the end came. Hitler and Eva walked into his study and closed the door. Everyone outside knew what it meant. Eva bit down on a cyanide capsule. Hitler pulled his pistol and shot himself in the right temple.
The underground bunker where Adolf Hitler committed suicide on April 30th, 1945.
When aides entered, he was on the sofa. Eva lay next to him. Following Hitler's orders, they wrapped them in blankets, carried them up the short stairwell, and laid them in a shallow crater outside near the bunker's emergency exit. Gasoline was poured, and a match struck. Shells were landing in the garden even as Otto Gunsche, Heinz Linge, and a few others rushed to set the fire. There were no speeches, no salutes, just panic and the crack of gunfire in the distance as flames consumed the bodies. Down below, the silence was crushing. People whispered. Some cried. A few packed small bags, thinking maybe they could break out through the ruins of Berlin. Others just sat and waited. There was food left, water tanks, and a working radio for now. But everyone knew the bunker was no longer a shelter. It was a tomb. Attention quickly shifted to Joseph and Magda Goebbels and their 6 children. The children were all given names beginning with H. Helga was 12, Hildegard 11, Helmut 9, Holdine 8, Hedwig 6, and Heidrun 4. They all shared a cramped room in the upper Vorbunker. Nurses and secretaries tried to give them moments of normal life, songs, little games, even visits with the dog before it died. But their parents had already made a terrible decision.
She was a dedicated Nazi. Joseph Goebbels made the decision also to stay with Hitler, then moved his family into the bunker.
Magda had been saying for weeks that life without Hitler wasn't worth living. She told people her children should not live to see their father branded a criminal. Joseph even added in Hitler's will that he would not leave Berlin alive. They had made up their minds. On May 1st, Magda asked for help from an SS dentist named Helmut Kunz. His job was to sedate the children with morphine so they would not feel pain. When they were unconscious, cyanide capsules were crushed in their mouths. Hitler's doctor, Ludwig Stumpfegger, was there. Magda herself was present. The 6 children died in their nightclothes, asleep in their beds. Who exactly placed the capsules has been debated, but the sequence, morphine first, cyanide second, is well documented. Court records and later interviews confirm it. Soon after, Joseph and Magda walked up to the garden, to nearly the same spot where Hitler and Eva had been burned. A few gunshots rang out. Their bodies were quickly set on fire. No crowds, no drama, just another grim ending above the bunker. For everyone else trapped below, the last 2 days were filled with dread. Some killed themselves, others tried to escape through the streets in small groups. A few actually made it out, but most did not. Power flickered on and off. Communication lines failed. The bunker had done what it was built to do, keep people alive under bombs. But by now, it was nothing but a trap. Survivors later said it felt exactly like being sealed in a tomb. Hitler and the Goebbels family ended their story below. Above, however, other Nazi wives were about to face their own endings. Nazi wives in panic as Germany collapsed. By late April of 1945, Berlin was falling apart, and Lena Heydrich wasn't waiting around to be caught in the rubble. She was the widow of Reinhard Heydrich, one of the most feared men in Nazi Germany, and she knew her name carried a shadow. In her house, she sat with stacks of letters and personal notes. Some went straight into the fire, others were shoved into bags. This wasn't random. It was survival. Her plan wasn't to head to another city or hide in some crowded basement. She was moving north, aiming for the Baltic island of Fehmarn, a quiet place where she thought she could vanish with her children. For people tied to the regime, this was the routine. Destroy anything dangerous, take the kids, disappear before the knock on the door came. Lena Heydrich wasn't the only one scrambling. Margareta Speer, wife of Hitler's armaments minister Albert Speer, was caught in the same collapse.
She continues her probe with her current work, Albert Speer, his battle with truth.
She wasn't in politics herself, but the Speer name was enough to drag her into the storm. The Allies wanted Albert Speer for everything he knew about weapons, fuel, and factories. He was a top priority, and that spotlight spilled onto his family. Margaret found herself watched, questioned, and cut off from money and freedom. It wasn't a courtroom yet, that came later, but the squeeze had started. Families tied to big names learned fast that there was no safe corner left. While families like Lena Heydrich's and Margaret Speer's tried to survive, Berlin was being crushed into rubble. By April 30th, Soviet troops were already inside the Reichstag, fighting room by room until it finally fell. 2 days later, on May 2nd, the city reached its breaking point. General Helmuth Weidling, Berlin's defense commander, surrendered to the Soviets. The guns went quiet, and the capital stopped fighting. Soviet field kitchens rolled in with food. Crews pulled bodies from shattered buildings. Neighbors made lists of who was still alive in each block. Water and power did not return overnight, but the city shifted from war to survival. That same day, Soviet photographer Yevgeny Kaldey climbed onto the Reichstag roof and raised a red flag. The famous photo was staged after the battle, but it landed in papers around the world and became the image of Berlin's collapse. Posed or not, everyone understood the message. Nazi Germany was finished. But for Berliners, finished didn't mean peace. Whole neighborhoods sat without power. Pipes and sewers were smashed, so water ran dirty or did not run at all. Food was nearly gone unless you had a hidden stash. Rubble clogged the streets, and unexploded shells lay under broken walls. The only places that felt truly safe were the giant concrete flak towers.
Why were these Nazi megastructures built? Well, with the value of hindsight and the subsequent bombing of Berlin, it seems obvious.
Anti-aircraft guns sat on top. Deep inside were huge shelters. The walls were about 8 feet thick, the roof nearly 12.5 feet, and 6 levels held tens of thousands of people. It was damp, dim, and the guns thundered overhead. But compared to a blown-out apartment, a tower felt like a real chance to live through the night. Outside the city, families faced the same fear in different ways. Wives cut their hair short and put on plain coats to pass as refugees. Some hid in barns and begged farmers to say they were cousins from another town. On the coasts, people pleaded for spots on fishing boats or bargained for space in trucks heading west. Drivers did not ask many questions. Fear drove every move. Fear of soldiers, fear of neighbors who knew too much, fear of shame. Years of propaganda still had a grip. Some believed that dying with the regime was loyalty. In the final weeks, Hitler Youth were even handing out cyanide pills at concerts, a chilling sign of how deep that message had sunk. Nowhere shows the collapse better than Demmin, a small town wedged between 2 rivers. When German troops pulled out, they blew the bridges and cut off escape. When Soviet units arrived, chaos spread. Fires, looting, panic. Families drowned themselves in the Peene River. Others used poison, ropes, or guns. The dead went into mass graves. Estimates range from about 700 to 1,200, with most historians landing near just over 900. Demmin became the stark example of what fear, revenge, and no way out could do in a matter of days. Even at the top, the fall moved just as fast. Admiral Hans-Georg von Friedeberg became Navy chief when Dönitz replaced Hitler. On May 4th at Lüneburg Heath, he signed a partial surrender to the British, covering northwest Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands. He sat at the table again at Reims on May 7th and in Berlin on May 8th for Germany's full surrender.
On the 8th of May, 1945, the heads of the German army signed the Articles of Unconditional Surrender to the Allied powers in Berlin.
Less than 3 weeks later, on May 23rd, as Allied forces arrested the last Nazi government at Flensburg, he swallowed poison and died. He went from signing the end of the war to ending his own life in a few weeks, a sign of how quickly the top ranks unraveled. Meanwhile, Lena Heydrich's choice of Fehmarn tells you what survival looked like for the wives who planned ahead. Fehmarn wasn't a city. It was quiet, out of the way. She could walk the streets without someone pointing at her. She turned her summer house into an inn, called it Imbria Parva, and lived small. Former SS men sometimes stopped by, but her focus was clear: raise her children, live quietly, and keep telling her own version of her husband's story. Distance and control. Those were the lifelines for women who could manage it. Margaret Speer didn't have that distance. She stayed in reach, and because her husband was one of the most wanted men in Germany.
Albert Speer was the only Nazi leader to accept collective responsibility at the Nuremberg trials.
The pressure landed hard. Albert Speer was pressed for details about how Germany kept building weapons, even while its railways and factories were being smashed by bombs. He talked, and what he said didn't just matter to the Allies, it shook his family life too. The war ended in May, but for the wives of Nazi leaders, the questions had just started, and the answers could decide if they walked free or vanished into camps. The hunt for Nazi wives after the war. By the summer of 1947, the guns had gone quiet, but the arrests hadn't. Allied soldiers were kicking in doors, pulling out families of the top Nazi leaders, and locking them up. Ilse Hess, wife of Rudolf Hess, was one of the first names on the list. She was living quietly in southern Bavaria when American teams showed up. On June 3, 1947, they arrested her and sent her to the Augsburg-Göggingen internment camp. This was one of the camps the U.S. Army used to lock up civilians tied to the top of the regime. She wasn't charged with a crime that day. That wasn't the point. The point was control. Get her off the street, guard her, and start digging through her life with endless questions and forms. She stayed there until March 24, 1948. Before she was let out with strict limits on what she could do. Augsburg-Göggingen itself was no ordinary prison. It sat in what had once been a forced labor complex outside the city. The Americans put wire around it, stationed guards, and filled it with captured Nazi officials, party helpers, and wives or widows of men at the very top. Local accounts and later records list women like Ilse Hess, Emmy Goering, Henriette von Schirach, and Brigitte Frank, all held there at different times. This wasn't about comfort or fairness. The camp's entire purpose was to keep them boxed in while investigators checked their ties, traced their money, and pulled out every detail they could. For Emmy Goering, the fall came even harder. Her husband, Hermann Goering, once second only to Hitler, was captured alive and locked in a site the Allies built inside a luxury hotel in Mondorf, Luxembourg. The codename was Camp Ashcan. But don't let the word hotel fool you. The grounds were wrapped with barbed wire 12 to 15 feet high. Guard towers stood over the fence. Bright lights flooded the place all night. Soldiers patrolled without pause. This was maximum security dressed up in the shell of a resort. The Allies used it as a holding center to process the very top Nazis before shipping them off to Nuremberg for trial. Emmy was in U.S. custody during this same period, and like the other high wives, she was placed under guard near the courthouse while the trials unfolded. Her life shrank overnight, property seized, movements tracked, letters censored, visits rationed. The Americans literally had officers assigned to screen, cut, or block every letter linked to the defendants or their families. When Herman's verdict came on October 1, 1946, she was still under watch. When he killed himself with cyanide on October 15th, she was still locked into a world of schedules and guards. There was never a moment where she was simply a wife visiting her husband. Every single move was observed, every piece of mail read, every step contained. The Allies weren't making this up as they went. They had a playbook. In the American zone, the big order was called JCS 1067. It was handed to every occupation commander and spelled out who to arrest and why. Alongside it was a handbook listing categories of people to target: leaders, officials, anyone who had helped the machine keep turning. Once the fighting ended, the Allies agreed on a joint system called Control Council Directive No. 38. That system sorted people into 5 buckets: major offenders, offenders, lesser offenders, followers, or exonerated. Those labels decided what came next, whether you were banned from travel, banned from work, hit with fines, or allowed home. Nothing about it was hidden. It was printed policy. For wives, that meant if your husband had been high up, you were tagged for automatic arrest. Soldiers arrived at the door, and you were either shipped to a camp like Augsburg-Göggingen or placed in guarded housing near a courthouse. Once inside, you filled out huge questionnaires about every detail of your life under the Nazis, what groups you joined, what privileges you received, what you had known. While you filled out the forms, your mail was opened, your movements restricted, and if your husband was one of the Nuremberg defendants, contact was cut down to the bare minimum. It was rules stacked on top of rules until daily life became nothing but waiting. Margaret Himmler, wife of Heinrich Himmler, went through the same dragnet. She was arrested by the Americans, interrogated, and placed under guard. At the very moment the courtroom at Nuremberg was flooding with evidence of the SS's crimes, she claimed she had known nothing. She didn't become a public figure, but she was still pulled into the same cycle: detention, questioning, guarded release, and life under watch. Some wives faced extra grilling because of their husbands' last-minute moves as the war wound down. Take SS General Karl Wolff. In the spring of 1945, he held secret talks with Alan Dulles of the OSS in Switzerland. Those talks led to the surrender of German forces in northern Italy, signed at Caserta on April 29th and taking effect on May 2nd. When a husband had been tied to something like that, Allied investigators immediately pressed the family. Who had been in the house? What papers had been destroyed? Where had the messages gone? That was why certain wives were questioned even harder. The Soviets had their own way of handling things, and it was far colder. In their zone, the NKVD took old concentration camps like Sachsenhausen and Buchenwald and turned them into special camps. These weren't waiting rooms for trials. They were black holes. No letters, no visits, no set release dates. Families outside could go years without knowing if someone inside was alive. Hunger and disease ripped through these camps. Sachsenhausen alone saw around 12,000 people die under Soviet control by 1950. The contrast with the West was sharp. In the West, you got forms, hearings, and categories. In the East, you could vanish into a camp and never come back. Life day to day in the Western camps was stripped bare. Guards were there to stop escapes and keep order. Nothing more. The prisoners were fed enough to stay alive for hearings. Augsburg-Göggingen held hundreds of women at its peak. Some bragged, some denied everything, some said nothing at all. American officers complained in their reports that a few of the high wives acted arrogant, but the system stayed steady. Intake, questions, interrogations, then judgment under denazification rules. At Nuremberg, the restrictions were just as tight. The Allies didn't want families sneaking in money, propaganda, or coded notes. A U.S. Army psychologist, Gustav Gilbert, kept a diary inside the prison, and the archives prove how deep the control went. Staff were assigned to read and censor every single letter. Families sent notes that got blacked out or tossed. It wasn't personal. It was policy. By early 1947, the denazification system was running at full speed. Hundreds of German-run tribunals, called Spruchkammern, were operating under Allied oversight in the American zone alone. Nearly 1 million cases passed through them. The wives weren't dragged before the main war crimes court, but they weren't ignored either. Their cases were handled under occupation law. That meant bans on travel, bans on teaching or publishing, property seized, heavy fines, or constant monitoring. Sometimes it meant walking free, but never free of watch. And that mattered, because the Allied sweep wasn't just about punishing the men who had pulled triggers. It was also about shutting down the networks that had helped the regime survive. The wives knew the houses. They knew the safe rooms. They knew the code names on the phones, and where valuables were hidden when the front lines got close. That's why they were pulled in, grilled, and watched. The arrests and interrogations were only the start. The bigger story was how these women actually lived once the trials ended, carrying names that no one wanted near them. How Nazi wives lived after the trials. When the trials wrapped up, that didn't mean life went back to normal for the wives of the top Nazis. The courtrooms closed, reporters moved on, but their names didn't disappear. Those names followed them everywhere. They shut down job offers, kept their kids out of schools, and made neighbors slam doors in their faces. In West Germany, it all ran through the denazification boards. These boards sorted people into categories that decided exactly what you could or couldn't do. If you were marked as an offender, or even just a follower, you could lose the right to vote, be blocked from teaching, banned from running a business, or told you couldn't travel without a stamped pass. Over time, as the new West German state tried to move forward, some of these bans softened, but the stain of the name never left. Police kept the files. The war might have been over, but the name you carried still decided how you lived. We already talked about Lena Heydrich and how she turned her family's old summer house into a guest house and cafe called Imbria Parva on the island of Fehmarn. That's where she tried to rebuild her life, far from the spotlight, far from the cities. It was never luxury, it was just survival. In 1965, she remarried a Finnish theater director named Mauno Manninen.
In 1965, she met Finnish theatre director Mauno Manninen, whom she married for the purpose of changing her last.
It wasn't a fairy tale love story. Most say it was about taking a new name and cooling the heat on herself. Then, in early 1969, the inn burned to the ground. Welding sparks caught the thatched roof, and the whole place went up. Manninen died later that same year. But Lena never gave up defending her first husband. In 1976, she published a memoir that tried to make him look better, and she stuck to that line until her death in 1985. What fueled even more anger was that the courts allowed her to collect a widow's pension because her husband had been a police general killed in the war. That decision stood, even though people hated it. Ilse Hess went down a different road.
Ilse, I-L-S-E, Hess, H-E-S-S.
After her release from custody, she didn't keep quiet. She got louder. Her husband, Rudolf Hess, stayed locked up for the rest of his life, and she made it her mission to fight for him. By the early 1950s, she was publishing and speaking, putting herself in the middle of the far-right scene. In 1952, she released a book of his letters titled England, Nuremberg, Spandau. The bans on public activity were already easing by then, and she jumped on that chance. Police still kept an eye on her and slapped limits here and there, but she never slowed down. She kept pushing her message for decades, right up until the 1990s. For Ilse, it wasn't about wealth or comfort anymore. It was about loyalty to her husband and the cause, and she refused to let it go. Margarete Speer lived quietly compared to the others. She raised her children in Heidelberg, while her husband Albert sat behind bars in Spandau for 20 years. Visits were rationed. You had to save them up. She first saw him in 1949 under those rules. When he was finally released in 1966, he came home to Heidelberg and immediately turned to writing. His book, Inside the Third Reich, came out in 1969, and it made him famous all over again. Then in 1975, he published Spandau, The Secret Diaries. Both were bestsellers. The family lived in a house on a hill above Heidelberg Castle. Money was tight, so they rented out a floor to students. She avoided the spotlight completely, kept the home life steady, and let her husband deal with the cameras and reporters. She died in Heidelberg in 1987 and was buried next to him. Emmy Goering's story shows the complete collapse, from privilege to small, cramped rooms. Once she had estates, art collections, jewelry. After the war, it was all gone. She ended up in a modest apartment in Munich and stayed there until she died. She tried to reclaim her place by writing a book about life with Hermann. The German version came out in 1967, and an English version followed a few years later. But nothing changed. The name Goering was too heavy. Neighbors knew it. Employers knew it. There was no escaping it. She died in Munich on June 8, 1973, at age 80. Her daughter Edda lived with her for years in that same apartment. Edda never broke from the family line. She stayed loyal to her father's memory until she died in 2018. She was buried quietly, no public honor, no headlines. For the children, the choices were brutal. You could change your last name, move abroad, and start over, or you could stay and defend the family name. Many chose silence. Some went to the United States, Canada, or South America, chasing a new life. Others stayed in Germany, trying to blend into normal jobs and hoping nobody connected them to the past. Edda Goering was one of the few who didn't walk away. She stayed proud of her father until the day she died. But most children wanted nothing to do with the history. That's why you don't see many books or interviews from them. They stayed quiet on purpose. The war ended on the battlefield, but for these wives and their families, the shadow of the past never went away. Thanks for watching. See you in our next video.